Today's topic is Smart GT, Achieving Smart Communities Development at Georgia Tech. Smart City is a very hot topic now, so we're very happy to have Georgia Tech's Managing Director of Smart Cities and Inclusive Innovation, Ms. Debra Lam. Debra is in a newly created role to drive smart cities and urban innovation work across the university and beyond. Prior to Georgia Tech, she served as Pittsburgh's first ever Chief of Innovation and Performance and was a member of the Mayor's Executive Cabinet. Please join me in welcoming Debra.
Hello everyone, can you all hear me? Yes, I'm pretty mic'd up with 2 microphones now. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to talk internally and kind of share with you what I'm doing, but also really to seek your insight and advice and what we can do collectively. So think of this as very much an introduction, but also one that requires all of your insight and input. As was noted, this is a new role and new position. I came to Atlanta and Georgia Tech about 1.5 years ago, so I'm still relatively new to a lot of things, and I want to touch that, smart cities and that type of word or meaning has been going on at Georgia Tech long before I came, and it will continue long after. So it's not something I singularly own or responsible for, but it's really a collective ownership of all of us. And so I really positioned this presentation more as an interactive discussion of here's what I'm thinking in terms of opportunities and where Georgia Tech is, but also to look towards you to see what are you interested in and where do you think we can add impact around smart cities. So with that, I'll start with this question, and hopefully we can collectively ask this question as we go through this presentation. And maybe some of you already have the answer to this question. But the mandate that I was given was more, how can we position all of us, Georgia Tech, to actively lead, educate, do applied research, teach around smart cities and its greater ecosystem. Where does that play in, and how can we, really be at the forefront of this space? The first thing I want to do, when I do these talks is just set the stage a little bit in terms of when I say smart cities, what does that mean? First of all, I assume this room, everyone's heard the term smart cities? Show of hands? Yeah, most part. Now, how many of you know what it is? How many of you work in the smart city space or think you work in the smart city space? Yeah? Okay, all right. So now let me tell you what I think smart cities is. And again, with smart cities and these type terms, there are many and no definition of smart cities. But here's how I laid the groundwork. First of all, smart cities is a process-oriented versus an outcome. And the process means that it really goes to this left-hand side triangle through 3 kind of sides. The first are your components, which is just your nuts and bolts, your ingredients, what's needed, your hardware, your software, your data. What are the essential items that are the assets of a smart city? And a lot of people think, once I have the assets, then I am smart. It's a very, very nebulous correlation where people, I say, get into a tech arms race, especially around cities. So city A says, I have 10,000 sensors, therefore I am smart. And then city B says, aha, I have 15,000 sensors, I am smarter than you. And it goes up and up like that, thinking of the assets as smart. But as all of you know, a sensor is worthless if you don't do anything about it. So the function, which is the next side, is very critical. What do you do with those components? How do you apply it? Do you have the expertise? Do you have the capability? What's the operation? What's the maintenance? What's the business model to really integrate it into that? And then, all of this really leads into the vision. Why are you going to smart cities in the first place? What are you trying to achieve? And this really hands really well with the other outcome kind of terms that we hear: sustainability, resilience, those kind of terms is something that I think complements smart cities because it's the process. It's the evolving state. And what makes it so powerful now is for the first time, I think, we are now given the tools to really assess the baselines to achieve the targets around sustainability and resilience that we've been talking about for many decades and years. And we, especially here at Georgia Tech, really have that know-how to really take it to the next level. And that's really where I think Georgia Tech has that sweet spot where we have expertise in the function, in the components, and in the vision, all coming together, and why all of you are in those multidisciplinary roles to really drive that and take it further beyond the singular expertise that gets pushed in the smart city space. The second triangle I want to just highlight is smart cities. When people think about cities, they think very much the big C city, the urban metropolis term, right? And so we can only do smart cities if you're at a New York City, a London, a Paris, those kind of big mega city level. But if we think about the first triangle and think of it as very process oriented, there's nothing that denotes size or geography or population density or anything like that. And in fact, smart cities with a small c can really happen at all scales, from the individual to the mega region, right? Because you are just trying to think about how you can take the technology and the data and apply it to meet your vision. And there's no restriction on those levels. And that is a really inclusive and empowering moment because one, it denotes that many types of communities and sizes could be smart. And two, because it's a process, an evolving state, you now will be having the tools to be able to do that. And it's not something that only a small few can do. This is how I kind of think of smart cities as the basis and how I will drive it throughout. But any initial questions? I know this is usually things that I take on immediately on this slide. But once I build on this, there are a couple other points I want to add with this smart cities. And the second one is the infrastructure. So, when we think about smart cities, typically it's around the verticals, right? Transportation, energy, water, waste. But cities and spaces and communities don't work in verticals, right? And in fact, it's actually more like layers of a city, where the verticals are actually actively working together. So what are all the things underground, in a public space? What are all the nuts and bolts in terms of the wiring, the piping, the hardware thrown through? What's in the first top layer of the public space? In terms of the built environment and the social realm of which we interact. And then sort of what was alluded earlier is what's in the virtual space. That virtual space is now getting very exciting, and there's a virtual infrastructure that, is holding a lot of data and a lot of security that we also need to come and play. And when you think about these layers, it's important to think about how we interact within these layers and how our governance and public policy and funding functions interact within these layers. And that kind of denotes a lot of where we're moving in terms of the projects, in terms of the work with the smart city space. The other thing to think about with smart cities is really where do we have the most influence and control versus where are things that are outside. And this is an important part when we think about our stakeholders, right? Ultimately, where do we, you as scientists or as researchers, can affect change? And where are you talking about the change to whom? There's often a misperception when it comes to the city in terms of how much control they have over the built environment and their infrastructure, right? So if there is a pothole on the road, we want city government to fix it. If there's a traffic jam or a congestion, we want, government to fix it. But sometimes if you dig deeper, who's in charge of the budget? Who's in charge of the maintenance of that? That's not necessarily with one singular entity, especially if you think about the different levels of jurisdiction within local government. You all are familiar with the I-85 disaster, right? In terms of the traffic it caused, right? So we kind of blame City of Atlanta or Atlanta, right? But that was actually owned by many different partners, right? From local government to the counties to the states, and then who was actually in charge of maintenance, who's in charge of appropriating the budget, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very hard to think about this within a singular partner or a singular stakeholder. And it's important to think about where you have influence and where you have greater areas of concern that could then be directed. As we become a little bit more sophisticated in our smart infrastructure, this kind of concentric circles of change really affect how we view the built environment and how, what's the best sustaining model in terms of that built environment. And how we can actually think about creative ways to deal with these different partnerships. And I'll go into some of those partnerships later on, but think about this as we approach smart cities, because there's no one singular entity that says, I own smart cities and I maintain smart cities and I am in charge of the budget, of the public policy, of the financing, of the maintenance. Right? And certainly not because of the smart infrastructure, because of the intersecting layers that are involved, right? It gets very complex. And then the final slide I want to show you is the groundwork of smart cities, and what I think about the most is actually is the beneficiaries, and who's actually reaping the benefits now versus in the future versus as they evolve over time. For initially when we did smart cities, I would say it was a very disparate, unequal kind of movement. And what we found was that some of the smartest or so-called smartest cities in the world also perpetuated inequalities, right? The very tools that we found that were supposed to empower people with data-driven decision-making, with increased convenience and accessibility, actually made things a little bit harder for communities and where it was. And so what it's important to think about as we move towards smart cities is who's actually benefiting from it, and how do we address these inequalities that could naturally occur over time, and how we as a society are changing in terms of the demographic change, in terms of segments that are changing with that. And so as we think about these broader community concerns, smart cities should be pushed into these greater societal questions of benefits and outcomes. So this is kind of how I think of the definition of smart cities. I left it sort of at the end and at the beginning, but very simplistically, it is the integration and application of technology and data and similar kind of tools to improve the quality of life. That fundamentally is the process that can really steer us towards the greater resilience, sustainability, outcome-oriented processes. But that also is a very empowering thing for the researchers and the scientists and all the different stakeholders and students in the room. With that foundation, though, how do we actually apply it? How does Georgia Tech take that as the foundation and put it out into the next level? I'm going to show you 3 levels, and certainly they're not the end-all, be-all, and it's the start of this process. But the first and foremost is, what are we doing on campus, right? If you take the right-hand triangle that I showed you, in terms of the different spaces of smart communities, a campus is like a mini city, right? So we have, transportation, we have buildings to maintain, we have a constituent base of students and faculty and staff that live here. How does a campus, in terms of its operations, think about being smart? And how can we think about the campus being the live-in laboratory in terms of driving that change? So, we have a lot of really good researchers here that are now trying to think about working very closely with operations staff and trying to plug in that research to improve operations of campus life. And we have operations team that are really hungry for that, in terms of the latest research coming in. And of course, campus has that data set, right, in terms of energy data, water data, transportation data, that makes it a natural breeding ground for collaboration. We also have international campuses that could be a start, and they have a different environment. Producing smart campus-like activities here at Georgia Tech is going to be very different than a new built environment in Shenzhen in China. Right? And so how can we think about using our campus as that space for natural collaboration? And then, of course, campus is one movement. Where's our natural partner if we go outside campus? That is the city of Atlanta, right? So we naturally are Georgia Tech within the city of Atlanta as the partner. And this movement kind of goes into how I think of the third wave of town-gown relations a little bit. If you're familiar with a little bit of the town-gown relationship, the first kind of town-gown relationship that I see was, the Oxbridge system, where they were the university and the town built around them, and the university and the town kind of started that. The second wave was, when the university and the town, had shared real estate or shared kind of operations in terms of public safety and, that kind of interworking partnership collaboration. What I'm very excited to really see is the third wave, the third kind of iteration of town-gown relationship, which is really trying to institutionalize R&D into city operations. And what does that mean? So for a city, they basically don't have the capacity, the expertise, the time to really do R&D. Right, to really think about the built environment and operations in terms of that level of innovation. And for a university, obviously, we are rich with that kind of innovative research and innovative thinking, and obviously very much welcome the desire to try out some of this research. And so it becomes a very good matchmaking exercise where we can kind of partner together to identify what are the most critical priorities or challenges that a city can have, or in this case Atlanta, and to see if there is very good research that can be identified and move forward in that regard. And this is coupled with a more extensive, data sharing agreement that we have with the city, and ongoing senior leadership collaboration that helps identify that. We spent many months with city and Georgia Tech lawyers to kind of build this grounding up, and from that we identified two major priorities that the city had, and this was in the previous administration, but these projects are still ongoing, and the process has been set to allow for that ongoing discussion. And they identified public safety and transportation as the main kind of projects. And I'll show you the two projects, and I will also identify the professor's names, so then if you have more technical questions, you can talk to them directly. But the first one is with Dr. Mike Hunter and Randy Gensler, and it's with traffic congestion. So you all can use Waze and other similar apps to kind of go from point A to point B, and it can kind of show you the fastest route. And you can even choose your routes. But what Dr. Hunter and Dr. Gensler are doing is adding additional variables to your route consideration, energy and carbon emissions when you do your route. And they're also trying to test it before you go on your route, especially if we're all going to the same destination. And this is especially apparent for special events, major events. So if all of us are going to the same destination of point A, Waze isn't necessarily tracking how we're going to divide ourselves up to avoid the congestion. This team is looking about how best to incentivize travel behavior and travel demand before we all go to the same route, such as the Super Bowl or some sort of major concert or event that's happening. And so that's you know, some innovative tools that they're doing with some models and an application that they started to spearhead at different neighborhood levels to kind of test run it. And it's identified with Renew Atlanta, who is the main agency that's in charge of public transport and transportation in the city. And so, you know, this is an example of Georgia Tech fitting into this broader innovative research and concern. The other project is with public safety and crime analytics, and this is with Dr. Yao Shi. And this is a really interesting project because this actually really touched upon why Georgia Tech was in that sweet spot. So the city was really interested in trying to do some data analytics with their crime incident report and digitizing their crime incident report. They put out an RFP and they got one response back in the 7+ figure, and it had to also be adapted substantially. And so that was something that, you know, the city saw, you know, maybe Georgia Tech can do something here. Maybe we can work with them to identify a project. And so, are you familiar with crime incident reports? Some of you? Anytime an incident happens, you know, the police officer has to fill out a crime incident report, which is this, right? So it's like time and place, what happened, and you know, the summary of each incident, right? And it's tens and thousands of crime incident reports, and it often is more crime incident reports than the number of, you know, police officers that are able to deal with it, right? So they definitely have this strong need. The latest in 21st century policing can digitize this crime incident report, but the digitization is still very much on geospatial terms, right? So it's just this top part, right? You know, where did the crime take place, the time, the type of incident, and you can plot it, you know, in terms of there's a peak time here that might have some robberies, and maybe you are less activity on this point in time with any criminal activity. But, you know, the bulk of the crime in terms of what happened and who did what is in the paragraph, right? And that's usually, you know, handwritten or typed after the incident by the police officer. And, you know, it's usually has the misspellings, it has, you know, various abbreviations, etc. So it's really hard to capture that that data. But obviously with ISYE, you know, they were able to take all that data and put it within a pretty substantial machine learning algorithm and produce something that could correlate the crime in an easier way for the police to track and train. And obviously it got smarter as the police got more training in terms of how to type about each crime incident. Since then, Dr. Yao Shi has then moved on to a second project with the police around beat redesign and thinking about where, you know, police officers should be reconfigured within a geography based on need and demand. So, you know, very good projects that I think capture what Georgia Tech is good at and what the city needs. That really addresses that. These are two very, very much in our wheelhouse with the city of Atlanta, but we've also been lucky to do work within the greater metro Atlanta region. And so, you know, I'll show you one more project with, and this is with Dr. Carl DeSalva and Chris Ladantic, that they're looking at stakeholder engagement. And they've done a series of workshops throughout the city to think about how stakeholders perceive and understand smart technology and how that feeds into how we plan and design our built environment in our housing. So, you know, think about all the different skill sets that Georgia Tech had, you know, from the transportation engineering to ISYE to, you know, more of the literature, media, and communication side, all coming together within smart communities and trying to address critical needs around the quality of life and built environment. So that's City Metro Atlanta, and that's great. That's a singular kind of entity. But we at Georgia Tech are, of course, a public entity, and we have to think about the broader area. And so what are we doing with the rest of Georgia? What are we doing with, you know, communities that aren't the city of Atlanta, with that large density, with that large population, with that urban metropolis? And as most of you know, once you get outside metro, you know, the demographics, the geographies, the economies are incredibly different. And how do we account for those discrepancies, and what could be done? Because, you know, City of Atlanta produces one model, but if we can go outside and think about it statewide with lots of different communities, then that produces a whole nother model that then also can serve as a replication across the U.S. Because, you know, this is a sample of the U.S., right? You have urban metropolis that the city has, but then you have a lot of more rural communities that might not have the same kind of conditions. So what do we do about that? And this kind of goes into where we thought about smart cities in the first place. So, you know, sort of New York City is the front. And we thought when we first did smart cities, if New York City can do it, then it could be a model for everyone else. And we can just scale that down to everyone else. What we learned, though, the hard way, was that, you know, when you start in New York City, it's very difficult at that scale and that size because of the levels of bureaucracy, right? And even when New York City starts, they will pick a pilot, right? A pilot that's a smaller size within a neighborhood or a precinct or a smaller community, and then they expand, right? So what we said was just flip it. Why don't we start small, you know, in a smaller community and get all the stakeholders in the room, because you can, because it's a smaller community. And then with that, you can scale up and you can make it in terms of a cross transfer back to the larger cities. It's not to say you shouldn't do both, right? Because you should scale up and scale down, but it was very much one-sided. Only smart cities could happen at the larger mega cities, and then it can shift down to the lower cities or the smaller communities, when actually there's a lot of cross-learning that can happen across the board with all types of communities and sizes. And we guess that hunger and that motivation to do improvements in the quality of life would spur a lot of smaller communities to move quickly, or more nimbly, or more efficiently or effectively than your New York cities and your bureaucracies. So we tried that. And we started actually at the mayoral level. So we invited the state's mayors to come. I mean, these are your, you know, second-tier mayors, your Savannahs, your Romes, your Columbus, and your Macons to come and started thinking about, you know, what are the executive leadership kind of visions that need to happen to then infiltrate. And we've been hosting the mayors every semester since, in terms of providing that, I would say, closed-door gathering where they can talk to each other and share their ideas, not only on the outcomes of what they were planning to do or tried to do, but the process in terms of how they got there. And that kind of communication around smart communities really started an engagement that went on beyond that. But, you know, we started at the mayoral level in terms of the statewide initiative. The other thing we looked at was the bases. You know, Georgia obviously has some military bases. So, you know, we started thinking, what can the base do? Because that's also a mini city, right? The same kind of operations in terms of supply, same transportation. You know, what can the base do that could also affect the surrounding community? You know, and what can be done with that shared infrastructure? And this kind of accumulated to the Georgia Smart Community Challenge, which ultimately I can tell you, I'll show you this program, but we must have spent 10 months plus planning and preparing for this before we launched it. It was a pretty big endeavor, especially since I was so new to Atlanta and Georgia, to kind of get this going. But it's been a very interesting experience. And the mission of this is basically, it's the first of its kind statewide effort that's a challenge grant offered to communities of all sizes, so there's no restriction, to apply for technical assistance, obviously financial assistance, and you know, the mission to implement their Smart Communities Plan. So we wanted to have the smart communities development ideas come from them versus us helicoptering it. We also, during the 10 months of planning, did a lot of engagement with the communities to understand whether there was a need and a desire and interest to do this. And you know, all those proved to be a very, very positive across the board. And especially at our current times when there isn't a lot of activity happening at the federal level and beyond around smart communities development. It was a really interesting time to really say, we're going to take this at the state and we are going to model this for everyone and really mobilize everything. And it's going to be all communities, not of a certain population, not of a certain economic development scale, etc. It was any community can apply, and we will help you with that process. The other thing was, it wasn't just us giving them the prize money and then moving on, right? It was a commitment that we were taking to say, we are giving you, you know, we obviously need some financial resources, but we're not just giving it to you. We will stay with you throughout that process to help you implement that project. So we're gaining the research and learnings out of this, and we are actively as partners working with you on this. So there are a couple of things that really distinguished it from other challenges or other types of kind of grants that made it possible. And of course, we pulled together a whole coalition of partners, and I'm remiss, I don't have Georgia Chamber of Commerce logo there, but it was a whole group of partners that, you know, represented the ACCG and the GMA are the local government associations, and together they represent the counties and the cities that are 99.9% of the state. You know, we have the industry coming in with both the Georgia Chamber of Commerce and the Metro Chamber of Commerce coming in, as well as the TAG, which is the Technology Association, coming in to support. And then we have two state agencies, you know, both the Economic Development and the Community Affairs. Both signed on to say, you know, we want to be supportive. And what was great about all these different partners is each of them were thinking about doing some sort of smart community, smart city program, right? And we, Georgia Tech, come in and say, hey, why don't we do something together? It may be a little bit beyond what you were thinking, but I think we can leverage our resources and work together on this and really make an impact and really make a difference for Georgia. And that was, frankly, a very easy sell altogether. And you know, since then, we've had, you know, a series of partner meetings, and each partner knows when they need to step in more, you know, to do certain parts of the project. And they know that together we are working on this bigger pilot and initiative. And so we did a series of workshops and outreach, you know, for this challenge. And what was incredible was when we started doing the math, it kind of showed 2/3 of Georgia being represented across the state. When we held these workshops, we did physical workshops, but we also were cognizant of the distance, and we also hosted webinars to get people engaged and involved. We had a huge social media outreach, and just really try to mobilize the awareness around smart community development, and to kind of understand what the needs were, right, in terms of developing this. We announced the winners in Albany with President Peterson in early summer. And these were the 4 winners. And I'll tell you a little bit about these projects and what's going on with this. Is that, first of all, each community it needed to be led by the local government. But each community needed to have partnership. We really required, we didn't, going back to what I said earlier, I do not think smart communities can be done by a singular local government. It needs to be in partnership. So we required them to have partnerships. And the partnerships needed to not just be, a logo. It really needed to show, what was the partner contributing. And the local government needed to provide the highest level of government support. And so they had letters of commitment and support from the mayors or the county commissioners or whoever that is across the board, as well as the partners. The second thing that was really good and something I think was really unique about Georgia Tech and what I was really keen on is that we pulled together an incredible team of Georgia Tech researchers and faculty members to support this initiative. So, we really created areas where faculty could matchmake with communities. And we required that the communities needed to be paired up with a Georgia Tech researcher from the start. So they were developing the proposal together, not pulling in a researcher halfway or towards the end to evaluate. The researcher was very much committed and embedded as a team member and driving this from the very start. And when we finally did our selection, we went through an extensive criteria and there were external judges, et cetera, we were amazed by these projects. First of all, there are 2 counties, 2 cities to kind of show the mix. They range from Albany being 50,000 people to Chatham, Savannah being 1 million plus. And they have very different use cases, and I'll tell you about these use cases in terms of what it means to be a smart community. And most importantly, they paired up with professors in different disciplines and methodologies, right? So it's not owned by any one school or college. You have the premier expert in climate change and sea level rise, being paired up with Chatham. You have architect, that has done extensive work on autonomous vehicles in the built environment, being paired up with Chambly. And of course you have public policy expert coming in with data analytics that he's done in LA and all over the world, being embedded into the city of Albany now. So, a real exciting cross-discipline of Georgia Tech professors, being part of the team and having a very close relationship with the cities and communities. So with 2 projects, Gwinnett County and City of Chambly, they're around mobility. So City of Chambly is looking at first mile, last mile, that is going to use an autonomous vehicle to connect to 2 MARTA stops. So MARTA is a huge partner in this, and they're going to start testing with Ellen Denham Jones in architecture to look at how AVs can affect that mobility access. Gwinnett County is working on a connected vehicle master plan, which is actually a very advanced master plan that they've even brought AECOM in, and AECOM is super excited to really advance this as a model nationally, and obviously led by civil and environmental engineering. And then City of Albany paired up with amazing local non-governmental partners to address neighborhood blight. And look at housing analytics and the housing inventory that Omar is building for them through a housing inventory. And him and his team have been working with the economic development arm of the city. And then finally, Chatham County, and Russ Clark is here, and a member of the team, is looking at building a network of sensors along the coast to track sea level rise to address hurricane relief. And what's really interesting about this project, and I'll show you more later about this, is that the sensors are built in-house at Georgia Tech, right? And then they're being deployed by Georgia Tech team, and they are cost competitive, about $200, and you'll hear about that. And they're obviously collecting data that the city/county isn't able to do right now. And the first set of sensors have already been deployed. And so, all these things are happening on top of the match funding, right? So each of the communities, to put skin in the game, they were given funding, but they also had to provide match funding. And they mobilized in terms of what they were going to be able to provide, not only in terms of financial assistance, but also capacity and technical assistance. And so it's a huge, with the little grant money, they got excited because they got really empowered to do that. And like I said, all these projects are off to the races. We officially launched or announced the winners in the summer, and we're not actually having our kickoff workshop until September, but they have already started a lot of projects and work on this. And so, it really started to mobilize across the board with this. And I want to show you one video, and hopefully it's not too technically complicated, and it's only about 1 minute and 47 seconds, but this is the kind of excitement the local community gets when we, Georgia Tech, are doing something in smart communities.
Experts are using new technology to assess changing sea levels in coastal Georgia. The new Smart Sea Level sensors are fairly inexpensive and collect a lot of information leaders in our area can use. If you tap on tides, WTOC the Manual Road explains how this can be used to better protect you from the tide.
4 sensors installed on streets like Catalina Drive here on Tybee Island collected tide data for about the last 10 days. Scientists hope that real-time information can help coastal communities plan for rising sea levels. Community stakeholders learned today what these sensors collected during this month's king tide. The sensors are installed in potential flood areas and connected to the internet. Scientists can track how high and where the water peaks lie and do it relatively inexpensively. Georgia Tech senior research scientist Russ Clark says he can build and deploy a sensor for about $200. Savannah Alderman Bill Durrett says rising sea levels affect everyone in our area, and this technology could help cities like Savannah plan for the future.
Sooner or later, they have a street in front of their house that's flooded, or their house is flooded, or they can't get to work because the way they need to get to work is flooded. This has a direct impact on everybody's life on a pretty routine basis. It may not be necessary for the average citizen to have this data on some kind of ongoing basis, but it's important to them for us to have this information.
The Georgia Tech scientists hope to have about 100 of these smart sensors installed by this time next year. On Tybee Island, Amanda Brown, WTOC News.
Thanks.
Track the tide levels in Savannah and across Cumberland.
No, that's fine. How do you like the yellow jacket sticker on the sensor too? And how do you like the Savannah Alderman explaining why this is important to their community? That's kind of the impact that we're trying to go through, to be able to educate and empower them to be able to have better ability to deal with hurricanes, and that's fundamentally, to me, what smart cities and smart communities is about. I have 2 more slides, and then I'm open for additional questions. But, I've spent a lot of time talking about the 4 communities. We, at the end of the day, Georgia Tech, are beholden to all communities, regardless of whether they want or not. So, while we are continuing this deep dive program with these 4 communities, we are also out there talking to the rest of the communities in Georgia. And we also have parallel programs that address that. So, our workshops, have a deeper dive for the 4 communities, but the morning is open to all communities. We have now newsletters that go out to all communities because we heard that, they're not getting information about this and they don't know who to turn to. So we have that, and we're actually asking all our researchers on the teams to produce webinars so then they can address some of these critical issues and be able to connect with the communities at large. And as a whole, the use cases that I'm showing you, whether it's for housing and neighborhood blight or resilience and sea level rise, should be use cases that could translate and scale up across the board. There's no reason why it's enclosed even within Georgia, but Georgia, because of its stakeholders and all the different players and its commitment across the communities, show that they could be a model for others. And that's been, the really exciting part about all this. And that continued engagement is really an exciting part for all this stuff. Finally, I want to add one more slide, which is where do the students fit in? And that's something that has been an important part of my thinking too. You know, when I first set this up, I don't, you know, really have as much interaction with Georgia Tech students, and I wanted to make sure that, you know, we really bring all of Georgia Tech together. So, you know, at the most fundamental level, you know, the workshops and everything we do are open to all students. You know, the professors are paired up with, you know, their researchers or postdocs or grad students, but, you know, there isn't anything that we were, you know, very much deeply dived into it, and we are now going to be launching a Smart Community Corps. So similar to Peace Corps or AmeriCorps or Teach for America or those kind of fellowship programs, we are actually now going to mobilize to have Georgia Tech students embedded into the communities over the summer to then work closely with local government on the Smart Community Project that I talked about earlier, and really gaining that experience. There aren't that many, as you know, smart community projects out there, so getting this type of experience on the forefront, working with some amazing people is something that we want to be you know, supporting. And again, this is a multi Georgia Tech effort with Serve, Learn, and Sustain, and Strategic Energy Center and Epicenter, and obviously we're getting good inspiration from Office of Government and Community Affairs with their federal and Capital Jackets program. But you know, how we can, you know, really push forward on a Smart Community Corps program to address the students going forward. So I have talked a lot. I will just end with this slide, and I think this kind of summarizes what we are trying to do at Georgia Tech around smart communities. And then again, it's not the only thing. There are lots of other things happening. You know, we want to do more, and I really look to all of you for additional insight, additional guidance, and additional ways that we can partner together around smart communities. So thank you.
I have one more others may be thinking. Being a native of Pittsburgh, yins or y'all?
Yins, always yins.
Daryl?
Yeah, so this is fantastic. You've built up something wonderful in a very short time, so kudos to you and the team. So there were probably more than the 4 applicants. You had a really good submission pool, I think.
Mm-hmm.
What is it that's limiting that? Is it that it's 4? Is it capacity to manage? Is it the funding that was available?
Yes, good. So this is a pilot, right? So keep in mind, we launched this pilot in February after 10 months, and I you know, frankly, this is a pilot, so that limits it a little bit. The second part is funding. Right, you know, we were able to secure funding from Georgia Power and ARC. So each community got $50,000 to do the grant, and then each professor got $25,000, and then obviously had to get matched by the community. So you know, it's a small amount, but it's not enough, obviously, to do all the work. But you know, the community's really stepped up. So I think what's limiting this right now is it's the pilot and funding, but you know, the next question to that is, you know, can we do this next year, and can we expand upon that? And you know, I really hope so. You know, we're actively trying to work with all our partners to expand, and I would say expansion is twofold. One is, how do we continue to work with the 4 communities, right? What happens after the year 1 to really deepen the project? And then 2, how do we widen this to more communities, right? So we have lots of good intentions and hopes to expand, but you know, are very much focused on trying to make sure that this pilot is a success so we can expand.
You mentioned a lot mobility, and that's pretty normal to be there. As soon as the seminar series is with the Supply Chain Logistics Institute, I'd like to see your perception versus the flow of goods. So last mile delivery and all the pre-positioning of goods and multimodal stuff. How do you see this fitting within your overall?
Oh, I would love to be working with you on that. That's very much, you know, and you asked me the question and I asked you the same thing, and it's really, you know, why I am here, you know, through Tim's efforts is, you know, I see supply chain and logistics as a huge part that's not quite here yet, and it has major congestion, it has major fatalities, like there's a lot of issues that are across the board, and a lot of cities and communities are having different zoning and planning issues that are connected to that, as you know more than I. And so, you know, how do we get that first mile, last mile, and what are the different tools and technologies that could address that? Knowing that there are bigger congestion issues, knowing that there are bigger emissions and pollution issues, et cetera, et cetera. So I actually think that fits very well within this greater smart city space. But, you know, in all this work, it's really, how can I help create the platform and support the platform to support all of you? You know, that is how I see my role, you know, where, you know, the research and all of your expertise needs to be the driver and the lead, and I hopefully can help support that in that endeavor and across the board.
There's something that doesn't surprise me because that's what I've seen all across the world, but a lot of the funding for what you've been doing is related to organizations that are either government or very near to this. In supply chain logistics, oftentimes the driver, the people we work with that are at the basis of contracts and so on, are companies. Mm-hmm. But from the ground up, they'll be thinking first about their companies, serving the customer base, and then they see they're not alone, so they'd like to work with others. So now, can we put a consortium and all this? And the one of the blockages is to get the other side, the side that you're normally used to get excited and understand, okay, that those guys are legitimate and they can really contribute to this. So that's something that at Georgia Tech we could work at being leaders into making this happen. Because right now there's kind of a cleavage there, okay, so that it doesn't pass. It's, okay, there's the city stuff, but on the other side they talk about omni-channel city logistics and omni-channel supply chain, commerce, all kinds of stuff. And last month that are really tightly related, but somehow those two worlds don't talk, and it's very, very important that they do talk. So your initiative, I think, is a good start to get in that direction. So at SCL, we'll definitely try to get moving with you guys.
Absolutely.
Scaling down and up at the same time makes a lot of sense, particularly when you're looking at ways to minimize regulatory bureaucracy or bureaucracy in general in multi-jurisdictional projects. But when you go into less dense or smaller communities, is there less benefit, or is it harder to do these projects where there's less connectivity and network density? Like, where are the diminishing returns from moving away from the multi-jurisdictional?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously there are advantages and disadvantages on both ends of the scale for that, and for you've clearly noted that, you know, one of the difficulties in working with smaller communities is the data or the resources that are connected with the smaller community. But what's interesting in terms of how some of these communities have started to work together, and why even you see that in Albany, is that they're partnering with others, right? And so then it creates a better scale of partnership and whatnot. And so you're starting to see smaller communities come together on stuff, especially when we're starting to look at broader infrastructure investment, right, such as rural broadband, or some of the heftier investments in terms of assets. Communities that are smaller are coming together to share those kind of assets a little bit to make it more flexible, and to make it a little bit more hefty in terms of that. But it is something that we do have to contend with. In terms of working in the greater smart city space. They don't necessarily have the same, level as your New York City. But I would argue that, in some cases, there's too much in New York City, right? It's not like all the data that New York City has, you actually don't need that much data. And then some of the data is like not the best quality, it's all over the place, like that scale is not necessarily where it's the easiest either. So, we want to try to work with what we have, but also recognize that scale is something that needs to be addressed a little bit on both ends.
Just as a follow-up, kind of a logistics question. When it comes to like your government initiatives or any kind of either financing or funding, is the state of Georgia providing any support in that area?
Oh, yeah.
And or do they have any specific, pending future regulations impacting? And kind of the logistics question. Anything?
I can say stay tuned. We're working on that actually right now. But it was very important that I got this 2 state agencies involved, and in the way we're kind of working backwards, where we've proven success and then garnered interest. So then we are in a better position to talk about those kind of discussions. But that is a stay tuned question. Yes?
My question is regarding like all the data, like who owns the data? How can like somebody in the community gain access to the data to provide some insights, or if it's only like from the
So this is what's interesting about the Smart Community Challenge. So I have data sharing agreements with all 4 of the communities. That was one of the requirements that I put in place with our legal team, because they are going to get the funding, so they should be sharing the data. And the data isn't just for the one researcher, it's actually for Georgia Tech at large. So, that data sharing agreement is in place. And now, the tough part with all of these data sharing agreements is how to execute them. How do we actually take it out in terms of security and protections and whatnot. But the base is there because they signed up to the Georgia Smart Community Challenge.
One of the things that is always come up with smart cities is like, do you want to build smart cities from ground up, or do you want to use current cities as a reference to a smart city? So what do you think are the 2 different challenges? Do you think leveraging the resources which are already in the cities, like Atlanta, like New York City, they already have a lot of data, they already have a lot of things in place, is that better, or just building smart cities from ground up what is better?
Yeah, that's not a new question. So as you know, this was a question that happened like 10 years ago with eco-cities and green cities and sustainable cities, the works that are happening in Masdar in the Middle East and, Dongtan in China. So it's always when you are doing these very, I would say, major paradigm shifts in terms of the urban built environment. Is it easier to do it in new built or for retrofit, right? And I not to punt the question, but it's very complicated, right? Because it affects the government structure as well, right? Because new build, as you saw, happens a lot in Asia and the Middle East, right? And that government structure is very different than the government structure, which is mostly retrofit in Europe and the Americas. And so it gets a lot more complicated when you're trying to do these designs, right? You can say that Songdo in Korea right now is considered a very green and smart city, right? But who lives there right now? You know, like there's a lot of more complicated questions and what makes it a successful smart city even. And you might even see some of the experiences that are happening in Toronto with the waterfront there and the complications with that because of the stakeholder engagement. So that's usually what spurs it. So if you don't have an existing community and all this existing infrastructure, then you can very easily create a city from scratch, right? But there's complications on that side too, especially when at the end of the day, even with the billions of dollars, you know, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg are also thinking about building a city, you know, you're running into policies and infrastructure that has certain restrictions and guidance. So yeah, without going too further, I think it's much more complicated. I don't think it's one versus the other. I think you need to add the layer of government involved and how it's done in practice. And I think it's something that is not just for smart cities, but just in a lot of development in general, and something that we need to be really sensitive to.
Follow up to that, what would be the 3 key points if somebody is, if let's say in a developed country they're trying to build a smart city, with your research and everything, what would be the 3 points that you would advise them on? That these are the things that you need to take in account for that city to be smart today and in the future, 50 years down the line. What are the 3 key points?
Yeah. So local context is really important, right? So, you know, how are you coming in? You know, what's already been happening, what's already being planned, you know, what is happening in that environment. We need to be really sensitive to that. There's often that helicopter consultancy coming in, and I think that ruins your credibility a little bit when you do that. The second thing is sort of what I alluded earlier is it's not the big shiny object. Do not come in and say, I'll just censor this whole place out and I'm just going to collect all this data and it's going to be wonderful. You know, it should never be spurred or led by the technology as the end. Technology is always an important means, and that's a tool to make it smart. But if you are just coming in, and that's what a lot of the industry does, just trying to, you know, geek out the whole place, that's often not very successful. And then the final thing is that there's a certain notion of resiliency that needs to be involved, right? Like I said, smart is a process, not an end state. So you need to really account for the changing dynamics and the nature of technology, of data, of stakeholders, of your environment to go. And I would say these 3 are not just in development. I think it's actually useful across the board, regardless of development level. Yes?
We heard a few key points already, talking about data, talking about Zuckerberg, Facebook, and also I heard about some really smart cities in Asia where I actually said, well, actually they're way too smart for me. Knowing when I cross the road, if I'm not supposed to, I get a negative mark on my account and such kind of stuff. Did you think about how smart do people want as cities become actually? Like where's the limit? I said, well, I don't want it to be smarter than that.
Yeah, I think a lot of smart, something that is missed is choice, right? At the end of the day, when we say smart, it's really given the choice to make decisions. And I think very clearly about the mobility challenge, right? How do you get from point A to point B? Those that are luckier, more privileged, they have choices. They have more choices of first whether to travel or not. And then if they do want to travel, here are the different modes of travel and transportation that they can get to. And each morning, they are deciding what are those different modes of transport. On the lower end of spectrum, they might not even be aware of all those choices. And even if they were, they might not even have access to that. And so they might be stuck with just the one singular choice. And if that choice breaks down or is unavailable, they're stuck. Right, so you know that smart comes with just thinking about how you can use that information and empower and benefit your life. And you may choose not to use that, but that's your choice in terms of that smart realm. And then not everyone has that. Okay.
So can you tell us a bit about what were the parameters you considered to shortlist these particular projects? How did you rank the projects in that particular order?
Yeah, so a little bit about what I said earlier. So they had to come in with a strong local government mandate, you know, like a letter of support coming from the mayor or the top executive. You know, what we've seen in smart cities is that if you don't have that executive mandate or vision driving that, you're going to be less successful. Secondly, you know, the partnerships, you know, who are you engaged in? Who are they involved? Are there clear roles? Are they committed to this? Obviously, the Georgia Tech research component is an important part, and, you know, really showing that, you know, the research is embedded versus they're just adding a name at the very end and saying, and we will have Georgia Tech researchers come in, right? You know, like the proposals really showcase that. And then, of course, you know, innovative, impactful, budget, how they were using the funds, you know. And if you go to our website, in transparency purposes, each of the winning proposals is on the website. So you can actually see what distinguished these proposals and how they thought about that. But you know, keep in mind, the proposals versus what's going to happen during the year, that's going to evolve, you know, as they think of new projects. But, you know, what was great was that they really thought about it. It had a firm foundation. There was a strong financial model. It was something that was going to be impactful, innovative, something that wasn't just normally done. And they pulled together a partnership to do that. Okay, yeah.
So I want to ask, when you actually think of smart cities, do you ever feel there is a resistance from the communities or the people of the government to actually employ such ideas, as to people might not really want something, but in terms of, say, smart city, you have to do it anyways? So, like, say, basically collecting data or something. So, if I might not like it, say, autonomous vehicles on the road, people might not be open to the idea so much as of today. So, do you ever feel there is a resistance to an idea?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that comes a lot during what you're saying with data and privacy, right? So a couple things about that. This is very new, right, in terms of the amount of information that's being collected. So we are entering very new territory, and there isn't necessarily a precedent that we are walking. Secondly, is that unless you live in a box, your data is being collected, right? Like if you have a phone, your data is being collected. So to say like, you know, you will not have that is just unrealistic. And then connected to that, your data at some point will be compromised. We just live in a world where we can put the most extreme securities and be super protective, but there is no guarantee. And I say that as a former CIO, right? So there is no guarantee with that evolving, and I think it's unrealistic to put that lock. But with that said, our norms about privacy, about data, as you might all know, are evolving, right? It's evolving in a sense that it's a cultural relativism in some ways. China thinks very differently about privacy than we do in some cases. Millennials and younger folks think differently about privacy and sharing data than the older folks. So you can start splicing and dicing some of these demographic changes with the evolving standards of what we think about privacy. And that leads to the final, which is what is the role of the government, or what is the role of us all when we are faced with these kind of variables about data and privacy. And so there are some governments that actually have put out some really good privacy standards or data. Seattle has led a really good one that is led by stakeholder engagement. So it kind of really denotes, you know, here's what we're thinking, what do you believe, and kind of has that education that's connected. And I think other communities are starting that. And I think, you know, there is a new frontier as we think about that. And even the newer frontier beyond that is the data monetization, right? So, you know, how are we profiting and valuing from all this data, and who should be valuing and profiting from this? So all new territory, all what makes it super exciting about smart communities as you go into any one of these wider spaces. And frankly, there's still so much to learn. There's still a lot to learn. There's still a lot to to really think about and evolve. And I do think all of you are at the forefront of a lot of this exciting research and study and change. So thank you. Okay, thanks.